Okay, it's Monday night. We are on Parashat Toldot and gonna starting to shift towards the second half of Chumash Breshit. It's probably an interesting question to think if Breshit really is divided into halves or thirds, quarters, and how you would break up the book in its entirety. Um, I I almost view um, the creation of the world through the Avraham stories as potentially one unit. But some could really argue that all the way through Yitzchak is kind of the first half, and Yaakov and his family is sort of the second half. Lots of ways to break it up, but we're somewhere in the middle, and we have an interesting essay for tonight as Rav Et Shalom continues to share different tools. Certainly, one of the continuing themes is really to, as we just started to do, to create structural units. Even the work that he does, that's a sort of a straightforward, but we don't always take the time to do it when we study. We often just take each verse as it comes, but to create units and write out little section summaries and outlines often helps us notice things that we wouldn't notice otherwise. When you read as a straight narrative or you take it one verse at a time, you don't necessarily see the substructures that are present. And it's a good practice as we read stories and as we read through the Chumash to try to do some of this more, diagramming or mapping in a sense. Sometimes it gives us insights we wouldn't otherwise see. So let me share my screen. This is chapter 15, Yitzchak in Gerar, Mirror Narratives. In chapter 4, we viewed both creation narratives as one large chiasmus. We didn't get to do this because we did not do Parshat Breshit together. We started in at Noach, which may or may not deflect the challenges to the unity of the text, but allowed us to identify a subtextual message about the very nature of creation. If we were reading it correctly, we unearthed a statement about God's universe that lay, quote, between the lines. That's again the title of this book, of the text. In other words, I don't know what the particular, I didn't read that chapter, so I don't know what the particular message was, but the point is that, one point of reading chapter 1 and chapter 2 of Breshit as structurally cohering as opposed to two alternative narratives could potentially be that it helps you push back against the argument these are two different stories, two different authors, whatever you would want to say. But he points out it doesn't necessarily do that work. You could have two different authors or versions or stories that are then woven together by an editor to create a holistic unit. But either way, it's certainly having these two stories and seeing them as a chiastic structure gave some additional meaning. In this chapter, we will take the same tool, the chiastic structure, to address a difficult and age-old question, albeit of a much more mundane nature, regarding relationships within the patriarchal homes. The desired blessing. Vayigdelu hane'arim, the boys grew. This is at the beginning of the parashah, right after the inability to bear children, and then Rivka's conception and bearing twins. And Esav was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, and Yaakov was a quiet man, because that's the translation here of Ishtam, quiet man, living in tents. And Isaac loved Esav, Yitzchak loved Esav because he ate of his venison, kitzayid, because game or trapped or hunted meat, befiv, was in his mouth, literally. But Rivka loved Yaakov. Why did Yitzchak favor Esav? In other words, what is meant by kitzayid befiv? The reason that the Torah gives that he loved him because he ate of his venison. What is that? How is that a basis for love? And why did Rivka love Yaakov? The text does not directly provide any reason for her favoring the younger twin. Instead of adducing an answer from isolation, i.e., information presented about each of the characters in isolation from the child or parent in question, one needs to look at what the text tells us about their interactions. In other words, we can't assume that a reason Rivka loves Yaakov has to do with something separate and distinct about Yaakov's character. We have to assume it has something to do with something we can infer from the way Rivka and Yaakov potentially interact. So we have a reason given for Yitzchak loving Esav, but we don't understand exactly how the reason functions. And we don't have a reason given for why Rivka loves Yaakov. We have to try to figure that out. A sensitive reading of the text will shed much light on the direct relationship between Yitzchak and Esav on the one hand, and Rivka and Yaakov on the other, which will help us to understand the favoritism shown by each shown each of the sons by his allied parent. Right, Bracha writes in with Esav, the love is conditional and unconditional with Yaakov. That's absolutely a fair argument, um, based on how the text presents it. But we could also argue that it's conditional or is based on something. It's just not presented here. It's a very open. It's a verse that invites a lot of different interpretation. When I was discussing it with some fourth and fifth graders this past Saturday night at Parent-Child Learning, we were also pointing out that, and I think the translation here does a good job favoring that it never says loved only, right? It didn't say, and Yitzchak loved only Esav, but Rivka loved only Yaakov. Just the text emphasizes one love for each of them amongst their children, and so that leads to an interpretation that it's favoring as opposed to exclusively loving. Okay. The one narrative in which we see direct interaction between Yitzchak and Rivka and their children, and indeed the only place where we find any dialogue between the two parents, more on that later, is in the story of Yitzchak's deathbed blessing, or so he thought, intended for Esav, but taken by Yaakov at his mother's behest. A brief outline of the section is in order. We have Esav marrying Hittite women, Yitzchak speaking with Esav, the information, and the implication, right? I'm going to die. I don't know when I'm going to die. I want you to go get me meat so I can bless you. Rivka overhears Yitzchak's request of Esav, and Rivka speaks with Yaakov. She passes on the information. She then tells him, the solution, go, I'm going to get you these, skins to put on your arms, and you'll go get the blessing. Yaakov's concern, what if he realizes, and I'm going to be deceiver in his eyes, and Rivka, it's on me. Then we have Yaakov's preparations for entering his father's tent, the food, the clothing, the masquerade, and the final preparations. Then we have the encounter between Yaakov and Yitzchak, the approach and the confusion, right? The voice is the voice of Yaakov, but the arms are the arms of Esav, etc. And then the actual blessing which was given. Then we have Esav's interaction with Yitzchak, his approach and confusion, right? The great trembling that Yitzchak trembled upon realizing that this is now Esav, and therefore who was it before who came and stole the blessing? Esav asking, did you have any blessing left for me? And Yitzchak giving a blessing. Then we have Esav's reaction to Yaakov's theft, Rivka overhearing Esav's plans, Rivka and Yaakov, where Rivka says, you better flee to my family's house in Padan Aram, and then Rivka talking to Yitzchak, saying, I'm bitter over these Hittite women. I don't want Yaakov to marry a Hittite woman. That's the end of the chapter. Of course, it continues right into chapter 28, in which Yitzchak then speaks with Yaakov and tells him, go marry a woman from Padan Aram and go there, and let me give you an additional blessing, the blessing of Abraham. But we're ending here in the end of chapter 27. It should already be clear that a number of parallels are operating in this narrative, right? If you just look through, you can see lots of different parallel sections here. How significant and enlightening they may be is another question, but we will use this as a starting point for our discussion. First, a tangential issue must be addressed, the resolution of which will affect our access to this narrative and its parallels by properly identifying the contours of the literary unit with which we are working in order to broaden our understanding of Rivka's favoring of her younger son. Sometimes as we read through Rav Shalom, as much as he tries to be kind of methodological and methodical, you read and you say, I don't know if I could replicate this, this model because he lays out a basic approach, but then he says, okay, we have to do some other work on the sides. It's not easy to always just be able to plug in a set of operations and get the analysis that he gives. If we are to utilize the interactions recorded in chapter 7, the blessing narrative, to explain the parent-child alliances as presented at the beginning of the Yitzchak Rivka narrative, right, which is that Yitzchak loved Esav because he fed him and Rivka loved Yaakov, we will have to reckon with the apparent chronological gap that divides them. Subsequent to mentioning the marriage of Yitzchak to Rivka, the Torah immediately tells us about her long-awaited pregnancy, the attendant confusion and consternation. This is all the very beginning of our Parsha. The prophecy that evidently assuaged these concerns, the birth and naming of the twins, and a quick snapshot of their maturations, literally just the first 4 or 5 verses of the Parsha. And the boys grew, and Esav was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, and Yaakov was a quiet man living in tents. This is followed by the story of Esav's sale of his birthright, sealed with the meal of lentil porridge. Subsequent to that, the text focuses on Yitzchak's attempt to descend to Egypt to escape the famine in Canaan, his sojourn in Gerar, including another wife-sister incident. This is the third. We had 2 with Abraham, one with Abraham in Egypt and Paro, one with Abraham in Gerar and Abimelech, and now one with Yitzchak in Gerar and Abimelech. And his successful return to Beersheba, where he signs a pact with Abimelech. It's only after all of this that the blessing narrative unfolds, as outlined above. How then can we use information gleaned from the much later story of Rivka's interaction with Yaakov to shed light on the earlier report of her love for him, right? So the technical question he's asking here is, if the best way to understand Yitzchak loves Yaakov because he gave him meat, and Yitzchak loves Esav because he gave him meat, and Rivka loves Yaakov, no reason given, is to try to discern something about Rivka's interactions with Yaakov. Well, we have Rivka's interactions with Yaakov, but there's a whole chapter that intervenes between them, and so how can we sort of jump over that? So we're going to address whether we're actually jumping over or not. A quick scan of the story of Yitzchak and Rivka in Gerar, chapter 26, in other words, between the opening of the Parsha, where we hear about the parental favoritisms, and the section of the blessings, where we would get some information about that might help us understand those favoritisms. Quick scan of the story of Yitzchak and Rivka and Gerar points us to one puzzle, which I have not seen addressed by any of the classical commentators. In order to highlight the puzzle, let's quickly review the chapter. Yitzchak's descent, right? He goes down to Avimelech and Gerar. God's revelation and blessing. God telling him, don't go down to Egypt. I'm going to, give you great blessing. The wife-sister story. Yitzchak's material success in Gerar. The wells. All these conflicts between Avimelech's servants and Yitzchak's servants. God's second revelation in Beersheba. Avimelech proposes a pact, and then the well. Following Yitzchak and Rivka's life to this point, we see them descending towards Egypt, but only getting as far as Gerar by divine fiat, right? When they get to Gerar, God tells them, don't go down to Egypt. And one of the questions we ask when we read that verse is, who said Egypt, right? So one possibility is we know that Abraham went all the way down to Egypt the first time he had a famine. So maybe we just assume Yitzchak knows that, he's thinking about Egypt, and God comes to sort of sway him. I don't think Rav Shalom is even assuming that. He just says, God told him don't go to Egypt. God must have known he was planning to get all the way to Egypt. He wasn't planning to stop in Gerar. But, because God tells him don't go down to Egypt. God knew what his intent was. But following Yitzchak and Rivka's life to this point, we see him descending towards Egypt, but only getting as far as Gerar, with twin boys in tow. Boys who are already old enough to have mastered the bow and arrow and the subtleties of business acumen. Meaning, if in the beginning of the Parsha we learned that Esav was a man of the field, Yaakov dwelt in tents, and then after that it says that they went down to Gerar, then they went down to Gerar with these professional children. It does not stand to reason that they would have left their only seed behind, especially because they were both unattached and had not yet taken on the responsibilities of family life, right? Could we assume that Yitzchak and Rivka would have gone down to Gerar and left Yaakov and Esav, these young adults, behind, with didn't have their own families. So the puzzle of chapter 26 is, where are Yaakov and Esav? It's a good question. This question is more serious than it appears at first. Once we consider the series of events which unfold in Gerar, how could Yitzchak pass Rivka off as his sister if they had two grown children living with them there, right? If Yitzchak and Rivka had gone down with Yaakov and Esav, and then Yitzchak's going to say, "This is my sister," they have these two grown children. Remember, the earlier wife-sister stories involving Avram and Sarah, one in Egypt and one right here in Gerar, occurred when Sarah was still childless. Following that model and the inherent difficulty in pulling off such a ruse with children as contradictory evidence, it's hard to read the wife-sister story here as taking place with Esav and Yaakov nearby. Parenthetically, the only classical commentator who addresses the Esav-Yaakov issue in Gerar is Ramban, who states that Yitzchak would have passed them off as another woman's children, right? Meaning the assumption being they did bring them down, because we already know from the previous chapter they were born, so they brought them with them. And so Yitzchak would have somehow had to say, "Oh, these are my cousin's kids," or whatever it is, in order to make it believable that Rivka was his sister. We will revisit this comment further down. Once Esav's hobby or lifestyle of a hunter is established, how could he not have gotten involved in the confrontations that his father had with the Philistines over the wells? This is a little bit, to me, of a not a far-fetched question, just to not, there are answers that could be given, but it's again, it gives us pause to think, okay, yes, if you're imagining how this story unfolds, and there's all this fighting between the servants of Yitzchak and the servants of Avimelech and conflict over these wells, and Yitzchak has a son who's knows weapons, why would we assume that he would, be absent from this story? Certainly, the rabbinic representation of Esav as a violent person and a murderer makes his non-involvement in Yitzchak's battles all the harder to understand. A third question, not directly stemming from the absence of Esav and Yaakov from Gerar, but impacting on it, takes us to the next chapter. Yitzchak sent Yaakov away to Padan Aram to find a wife. That was Yitzchak's perspective. And to save his own life. That was Rivka's motivation, right? If you look at the end of chapter 27, beginning of chapter 28, Rivka says, brach lecha, run away to my brother Lavan. And Yitzchak says, kum lech, get up and go and get a wife in Padan Aram. So they have different ways of framing the journey, but either way, he's sent away to Padan Aram. The verse that describes Yaakov's exile to to Haran is, and Yaakov went out from Beersheba and went towards Haran. Why does the text have to mention that he left Beersheba? Since that is the location where the family is located at the end of chapter 26, we presume that that is the place from which Yitzchak sent Yaakov. The cogent and insightful observations of commentators as to the need to mention Beersheba, beginning with Rashi, the departure of the righteous man from the town leaves an impression, to Rav Yitzchak Soloveitchik, the Brisker Rav, who aligned the two purposes in Yaakov's flight with the two phrases, notwithstanding, the verse does communicate seemingly superfluous information, meaning the commentaries made lots of interesting takes on why it goes, the text unnecessarily tells us again that Yitzchak left, that Yaakov left from Beersheba, but it is superfluous. That's where they were before. Again, you could give various explanations, but it doesn't seem totally necessary. The most evident and reasonable solution to these questions is for us to reconsider the sequence of events. So again, if you're following, just reminding us, the question here, the framing here is, we want to understand more about Yitzchak's relationship with Esav and Rivka's relationship with Yaakov and why they favor each one. The best place to look for that is the dynamic of their actual interactions. That happens a whole chapter removed from the statement of their favoritisms. And in between is the chapter of Yitzchak and Rivka going down to Gerar. And when we look at that chapter, we actually say to ourselves, wait a minute, how does it narratively fit in to have Yaakov and Esav present? They're absent from the story. We would have expected them to be involved. It doesn't make sense for Yitzchak to pass off Rivka as his wife if they have two grown children with them. Something's funny about the intervening of this chapter in between the statements of the favoritisms, and the descriptions of the relationships that would give us material for that. We approach all biblical texts with a number of standard assumptions, including the notion that the sequence of the story is chronologically consistent, save when overriding considerations render that impossible. Ramban is the staunchest supporter of the chronological sequencing, known as Yesh Mukdam u'Meuchar b'Torah. There is before and after, meaning there is chronology in the Torah. The way the Torah orders its story follows historic, time chronological order. That's the default assumption, and Ramban is the staunchest supporter. Yet even he admits to occasions where the text is clearly and blatantly in violation of chronological sequencing. The clearest example is Numbers 9:1 in light of Numbers 1:1. Just to prove this point, I'll show it to us for a moment. I think I have them right here. If it loads up quickly. No, here we go. Numbers 9:1, so the 9th chapter of Bamidbar starts, Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe b'midbar Sinai b'shana sheni letzeta me'eretz Mitzrayim b'chodesh harishon lemor. God spoke to Moshe in the wilderness of Sinai in the first month of the second year of their going out of Egypt. So we could call that Iyar of the second year of going out of Egypt. That's chapter 9. Then we go back to Bamidbar chapter 1, 8 chapters earlier, and it says, God spoke to Moshe in the wilderness of Sinai in the tent of meeting on the first day of the second month in the second year following the exodus from the land of Egypt. So we have, sorry, I said it ER, but I really meant Nisan. The first new moon of the second year, that is Nisan of the second year, is chapter 9. But chapter 1 is the second month of the second year, ER of the second year, meaning 8 chapters after the beginning of Bamidbar, we've gone back 1 month in time. And it's indisputable because we have the dates for each one. So the Ramban is forced to acknowledge that there are times when the Torah doesn't go in forwards time order when it goes backwards, only when it's very explicit. Again, when juxtaposition, completing one biography before moving on to the next generation, or other similar textual concerns are present, time sequence may suffer, right? So the Ramban accepts blatant examples, and then there are other times where the commentaries will suggest, you're in the middle of a story about a character, finish the story, and then backtrack to pick up what other characters were doing over that same period of time. Means that you would have to go backwards after you finished one story to the middle of the time period of the next story or the next character. So it stands to reason that there are going to be tons of exceptions, but that by and large, we're going to assume chronological order. Okay, we've piled a bunch of stuff here. It's slowly these are lots of loose ends that are going to get tied up, and we're hopefully learning some interesting principles and points along the way. The entire description of Yitzchak in Gerar fits the model of a younger man, unencumbered and as yet unblessed with children, whose wife is similarly unattached and can therefore be passed off as his sister. Esav and Yaakov don't intervene in Yitzchak's difficulties because they haven't yet been born. Chapter 26 is the first bit of information we're given about Yitzchak's life as a married man, detailing his material success and diplomatic political ascent. Now we understand the doubled phrase at the onset of Yaakov's fleeing to Haran. Yaakov left from Beersheba to go to Haran. The verse is difficult, a difficulty addressed by many commentators. If the last location mentioned is Beersheba, why reiterate Yaakov's point of departure? With our suggested reordering of the events, we understand why the text emphasizes Yaakov's point of departure. As Ramban points out, it was the family tradition to go to worship at Beersheba. This is what Yaakov did, leaving Hebron, where the family was living, to go to Beersheba to pray before leaving the land, just as he did before leaving for Egypt. Right? So actually, the reason we have to be told he left from Beersheba is because they weren't actually in Beersheba, even though that's the last place that was mentioned, because that's the last place that it was mentioned, because it was bringing us a story from that actually belonged in an earlier time. By the way, this also fits the model established by Avraham and maintained by Yitzchak and Yaakov. While traveling and without children, Beersheba was the settlement of choice. But after having a son, all 3 patriarchs settled in Hebron. Why this is the case is well beyond the scope of this chapter. For our purposes, noting the pattern serves to validate our approach. There's a lot as he says, beyond the scope, but this question of where the patriarchs lived at different points is confusing as you read Breshit, and a lot to try to unpack there. In brief, the birth of Esav and Yaakov and everything that followed from that birth occurred after the events described in chapter 26. We'll look at the psukim, just a quick scan through of the psukim in a moment so that we can get this clear. After Yitzchak returned from Gerar and settled in Beersheba, he returned to Hebron, where he stayed the rest of his life. The birth of the twins was followed by Esav's marriages and the deathbed blessing scene. Okay, so let's just open up the psukim so we can see this. Okay, so we have the beginning of our Parsha. Yitzchak was 40, got married, but the birth of the children doesn't happen until later. So we sort of pause here when Yitzchak was 40 and married Rivka. We pause here. We skip over this section. We jump to chapter 26, famine in the land, go through the whole story of Avimelech, finish at the end of that chapter, and then we backtrack to the beginning of our Parsha. The children are born. They get the various prophecies. Now they're already moving on to Hebron, from Beersheba to Hebron. They have the sale of the birthright. Then we jump past this because this has already happened, this whole chapter 26. And we pick up with the deathbed scene. And they're in Hebron. And that's why we have to then go back again and say Yaakov left from Beersheba because he stopped at Beersheba on his way, but that's not really where they were generally residing. Okay, so again, in brief, the birth of Esav and Yaakov and everything that followed from that birth occurred after the events described in chapter 26, the story of Avimelech and Yitzchak and Rivka. After Yitzchak returned from Gerar at the end of chapter 26 and settled in Beersheba, he returned back to Hebron. And now we're back up in the end of chapter 25 where the birth happens. The birth of the twins was followed by Esav's marriages and the deathbed blessing scene. One may challenge this on the grounds that Yitzchak lived 120 years after becoming a father. How could he have thought that he was near death immediately after their birth? Note that he lives many years after the deathbed blessing narrative, and that in any case, that narrative took place at least 40 years after the birth of Esav and Yaakov, making Yitzchak at least 100 years old, right? So even though it comes right after that story, still a fair amount of time has passed because they've certainly grown up a whole bunch. We also understand why Ramban insists on the boys being present in Gerar, right? Given that it doesn't seem to make sense, due to his customary allegiance to the principle of Yesh Mukdam U'Meuchar BaTorah. Any method by which the timeline can be maintained will be adopted and utilized, right? So Rabbi Shalom is saying, to him, as he reads it, the texts are much more compelling to say that chapter 26, the story of Yitzchak and Rivka and Avimelech and Gerar, happens right sometime after the marriage and before the birth of Yaakov and Esav, and it should be moved up, so to speak. He's less attached to the need for the Torah to be in chronological order. But someone like the Ramban, who's more attached to that, will therefore have to assume that it happened in chronological order, and therefore need to provide an explanation about how Yitzchak and Rivka could have this journey and call each other brother and sister if Yaakov and Esav are already born. And so he'll give an explanation about that. They were passed off as someone else's children. Okay. We have almost overcome the obstacle to using the information in chapters 27 to explain the cryptic comment in 25, right? Because we've taken chapter 26 and moved it up. So now we've almost brought 25 and 27 together so that we can read them, read chapter 27 to understand the favoritism, right? As you can see, it was a small question, but it gave us the opportunity to analyze this idea of how would we look at a story, what kinds of questions would we ask or notice that might provoke us to consider that it's not in chronological order, and what would validate such an argument. As mentioned earlier, in order to justify incorrect sequence from a chronological perspective in a narrative, there must be an overriding concern. What might that concern be in our case, right? So we don't just jump to saying the Torah is out of order. We need to say what would have motivated such a thing. Now we're going to get a second key point. The death of Yishmael, reported immediately after the death of Abraham, was significant for one reason. God had promised Abraham that God would also bless Yishmael, making him into a great people. And Abraham said to God, we're back in the end of Parshat Lech Lecha in Genesis chapter 17. And Abraham said to God, oh, that Yishmael might live in your presence. And God said, Sarah, your wife, will bear you a son indeed, and you shall call his name Yitzchak, and I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his seed after him. And as for Yishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him, and will make him fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. 12 princes shall he father, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant will I establish with Yitzchak, whom Sarah will bear to you at this set time in the next year. It was important to demonstrate the fulfillment of that promise immediately after Yishmael died, right? So God said, I've blessed Yishmael, and he's going to have a great progeny, great nations or nation. And now that Yishmael dies, this is in the end of Parshat Chayei Sarah, just before our Parsha, we need to know that the promise of Yishmael was fulfilled. So the end of Parshat Chayei Sarah, chapter 25, reads, now these are the generations of Yishmael, Abraham's son, whom Hagar the Egyptian, Sarah's maidservant, bore to Abraham. We get the names of the sons of the generations. These are the sons of Yishmael. These are their names by their villages and their encampments. 12 princes according to their nations, just as had been promised 8 chapters earlier. 12 princes. Okay, so there's a fulfillment there. Once Yishmael's generations were listed, confirming the fulfillment of the divine promise, the text listed Yitzchak's generations. This is not an uncommon phenomenon. For instance, immediately after listing Esav's generations, chapter 36, the text states these are the generations of Yaakov, Ela Toldot Yaakov, in the beginning of Parshat Vayeshev. The likely reason for this is that once we see that even the rejected member of the family, Yishmael or Esav, on their respective generations, is blessed with a mighty nation as part of the general promise to Abraham that his seed would be as numerous as the sand by the shore and the stars in the sky, it's critical to resume the central thread of the story with the successful generations of the selected member, Yitzchak or Yaakov, of the clan. Okay, so we have sort of two things happening at the same time. We're going to come back and see one of them developed a little bit more, which is when someone dies, we sort of have to see their lineage through, and then that's they're exiting the stage at that moment. As they're exiting from the covenantal line, we then have to circle back to the parallel covenantal partner and kind of establish their stability and security. That being the case, why doesn't the text simply state these are the generations of Yitzchak, Esav, and Yaakov? Move us to Gerar, and then fill in the details of their birth, their early years, and the fateful sale of Esav's birthright. A survey of the listings of Toldot in Genesis suggests an answer. Every time there's a mention of Toldot, there's a process of rejection and selection. When the Torah lists the Toldot of Terach, for instance, this is all the way back in the end of Parshat Noach, right before the beginning of Lech Lecha. When Torah lists the Toldot of Terach, for instance, we are immediately informed of the selection of Abraham and the rejection of his brothers. When we are introduced to the Toldot of Yaakov, that entire narrative is about the aborted selection of Yosef as Yaakov's heir to the patriarchate. Hence, it was important not only to list the Toldot of Yitzchak, but also to present the first steps of the rejection of Esav and the favoring of Yaakov as part of the Toldot schema. Right? So we were asking the question, why is chapter 26 placed where it is? Why not move it right up to the beginning in the end of chapter 25, where it belongs chronologically after the marriage of Yitzchak and Rivka and before the birth of their children? And the answer is, well, we just did at the end of Parshat Chayei Sarah the Toldot of Yishmael. So therefore we need to do the Toldot of Yitzchak. And the Toldot of Yitzchak have to tell us a little bit about Esav and his rejection and about Yaakov. And so that kind of all has to happen in successive order as a higher order priority to map out the kind of branching of the covenant. And only then can we go back and incorporate a prior story which is chapter 26. Now we understand why the sequence of chapters 25 to 27 is not true to the chronology of events. Yishmael's Toldot, again, that's at the end of Chayei Sarah, could not be left unanswered. Once Yitzchak's children are mentioned, the process of the selection of Yaakov and the rejection of Esav must be introduced, right? The story of the selling of the birthright at the end of that chapter 25. This is the overriding concern that mitigates the text's usual loyalty to chronological sequence and is why the births of Yaakov and Esav were recorded before the story of Yitzchak's descent to Gerar, right? And it reminds us, of course, that the Torah is not just, certainly not a history book, and it's even not just a story book. It has higher priorities, which is laying out the scaffolding of the covenantal generations, the selected, the unselected, and that's the kind of skeleton structure of Breshit, and so that has to take priority over other stories in terms of laying out the order. Okay. Analyzing the deathbed blessing narrative. Now that was all the background, but we're more than halfway there. Now and again, it was background to prove methods of how we read, the kinds of questions we ask, and how we relate to order of stories. He suggests following this section with text in hand, open to the end of chapter 26. In the interest of time, we're not going to do that, but you have these in your inbox, and feel free to review it with text in hand. Now that we've demonstrated that the events presented in chapter 27 follow closely on the events in chapter 25, i.e., that from the time that Yaakov bought the birthright until the deathbed blessing was not necessarily a long time. By the way, this makes the plain sense of 27:36 much more readable. We can look to the information presented in chapter 27 to aid us in understanding the enigma posed by Rivka's favoring of Yaakov as presented in chapter 25. So now, having dealt with chapter 26 and its placement and learned a lot along the way about the structure of Breshit, we can come back and answer our question, which was that towards the end of chapter 25, we learned about the favoritism of the parents. We thought that we would be able to gain more information about that, not just by looking at who the children are, but by the relationships and interactions between the parents and children, and that we get the richest load for that here in chapter 27. The structure, as briefly noted earlier, the section contains a number of parallels. Structure of the selection might best be represented as follows. A. Esav marries Hittite women. B. Yitzchak speaks with Esav. C. Rivka overhears Yitzchak's request of Esav. D. Rivka speaks with Yaakov. E. Yaakov's preparations for entering his father's tent. F. And this is the center, and so it's always what the text is drawing our attention to most, the actual encounter between Yitzchak and Yaakov, when Yaakov takes the blessing which was intended for Esav. Then we work our way back out. Yitzchak and Esav, they're actually directly interacting, as opposed to Yaakov. This is Yitzchak and Esav. Then Esav's reaction to Yaakov's theft. It's not totally clear yet how these parallel. He's going to tell us how they parallel. Rivka overhears Esav's plans, right? That one is much easier. We have first Rivka overhearing Yitzchak's request of Esav in the beginning, and now on the way out, we have Rivka overhearing Esav's plans. Rivka and Yaakov, again, not a non-obvious parallel. And then Rivka speaks with Yitzchak about Yaakov marrying Hittite women, parallel to Esav marrying the Hittite women. The chiastic structure goes well beyond the general topic of each subsection. So now we're going to analyze. A. Esav marries two Hittite women, thus strengthening our argument that the family resided in Hebron at the time, and not in Beersheba, where the most likely locals with whom to interact would be Plishtim, right? Whereas Hebron, we know that's where Abraham bought from Bnei Chet, from the Hittites. They are a source of bitterness to Rivka and Yitzchak, the only time that Rivka and Yitzchak are presented as having one common reaction to anything. It's tempting to think that these two verses were placed here merely to balance the entire section and to strengthen the overall sense of parallelism. We'll leave that temptation, okay? So A, the beginning of this whole story is Esav's marrying the Hittite women. And again, he's pointing out it doesn't seem to be so important necessarily, and it almost feels like it's there to set up the parallel to the very end of the story, which is Rivka speaking to Yitzchak about Yaakov marrying Hittite women. Rivka speaks to Yitzchak, the only time in the text that either of them speaks to each other, complaining about the Hittite women. Then the second inner parallel, Yitzchak speaks to Esav about his impending death, and using the transitional word ve'ata, and now commands Esav to go bring venison. Esav obeys without question. Then on the way out, Rivka speaks to Yaakov about his impending death, and using the transitional word ve'ata, commands him to run away to Lavan. Yaakov obeys without question. Then, as we're moving further inwards, closer together in the middle of the narrative, Rivka hears about Yitzchak's request of Esav. She introduces her report of the information to Yaakov with the word Hine, behold. And on the way out, Rivka hears about Esav's plot to kill Yaakov. She introduces her report of the information, again to Yaakov, with the word Hine. So we have these little textual, semantic clues in the parallels. Then getting further into the center, Rivka commands Yaakov to bring the goats that she will prepare. Yaakov expresses concern that he will bring a curse upon himself instead of a blessing. And on the way out, Esav reacts to Yaakov's theft of the blessing by plotting to kill him, the ultimate curse, meaning the thing Yaakov was afraid of in his reaction to Rivka's instructions is in a sense the thing that is now threatened. Now, as we get right to the framework for the encounter, Yaakov takes on the guise of Esav, bringing the food his father loves with coarse garments and hairy arms. And then Esav enters with the food his father loves with coarse garments and hairy arms. So you have the impostor or the pretender, and on the other side, in parallel, the actual figure. In the middle, the nexus of the selection, Yaakov's direct meeting with Yitzchak when he receives the prized blessing. There is no parallel to this subsection, nor can there be. If there were, Yitzchak's answer to Esav in verse 38, when he says, "Did you not save me a blessing?" would have been dramatically different, right? So by having only in the center the blessing that Yitzchak gives to Yaakov, the text is highlighting for us, there is no parallel blessing. Esav gets something, but there is no parallel blessing. It can't be two. It's only one. And that's what drives this whole conflict or competition that Rivka involves herself in. For our purposes, the significant sections of the chiasmus that may shed light on Rivka's favoring of Yaakov are B and D. In B, Yitzchak speaks to Esav about his death, but we hear no reaction from the loyal son, save to go a-hunting. The eerie similarity to Rivka's command to Yaakov in B prime highlights the difference. Yaakov flees without protest because it is his own life he is saving. It's the prudent thing to do, and protesting would be of no avail. That is certainly not the case with Esav's obeisance to his father's command. The later development of the story demonstrates that his zealous exit to the hunt was motivated by his desire to attain his father's blessing, not to bring pleasure to his father or to fulfill his command. Meaning there's nothing emotional in Esav's response. He just runs to do what he needs to do to get the blessing, but not engaging or connecting in some way with his father. In D, Yaakov's protests to Rivka fall in two categories, ethical and pragmatic. He's concerned that the blessing will backfire because his father will discover the ruse, and he's concerned he will fail in his father's eyes. When Rebecca accepts responsibility for these potential troubles, his concerns are assuaged, and he protests no further. He raises concerns, they're addressed, and he accepts. Whereas in D prime, Esav continues to whine and complain about Yaakov's theft. Nothing that his father can do will calm him down, right? So we have these parental attempts to reassure concerns. Rivka is effective with Yaakov because she legitimately puts his concerns to rest. Esav isn't able to be placated. He is, remember, the stronger one, the brother to be feared, yet he cannot be placated. We might still say, well, that's because the issue is a heavier issue. He missed out on his blessing, but you could also argue not. When we compare the way each of these sons responded to challenges and potential troubles, we can readily understand why Rivka favored Yaakov over Esav and why, as the prophet Malachi indicates, God's self validated her favoritism. The mature person, right there, that's a pasuk in Malachi where God says, basically, and I love Yaakov and not Esav. I hate Esav, God says. A sort of a parallel or validation of Rivka's perspective. Thank you, Brachas Brachas, putting in some further thoughts here about conditional and unconditional love. Chava's connection to Cain, also conditional, interesting. Great. The mature person, worthy of God's grace and favor, accepts the obstacles that face him and understands that his own shortcomings are the ultimate cause of his external obstacles. Once he changes that which is alterable and the terrain has been leveled to the extent possible, he faces his challenge head on. His realization of his own power is counterintuitively the source of his humility, which allows him to look inward for the solution. That which needs to be confronted is faced, and that which needs to be repaired is attended to. Once his own internal work has been done, he is ready to face the external challenges. This is a fascinating description of Yaakov, and more broadly, and again, I refer us to Rosh Shmuel Klitzner's work on Wrestling Jacob, one of my favorite books of all time Tanakh interpretation, which he delves so deeply into the inner psychology of Yaakov and the work he needs to do on himself and the ways he evades that and finally confronts it. It's a very beautiful sentence here. That which needs to be confronted is faced, and that which needs to be repaired is attended to. Once his own internal work has been done, he's ready to face the external challenges. The immature, impetuous Esav is unable to overcome his anger, to sense which way the wind blows, and to adjust accordingly. To say, okay, I didn't get the blessing that was promised me. I can't control that anymore. I have to work on my response. He looks for devils outside of his heart, and as such, never solves the problem that lies deep inside. We'll end with an insight. So again, this was all the way back. This was called mirror narratives, right? And the idea was that by looking after having dealt with the first half of the essay, which was about the issues of placement and order in the Torah, then we were able to bring the end of chapter 25 alongside chapter 27, look at the deathbed blessing, quote unquote, deathbed blessing scene, and look at the parallel sections in them, the mirror narratives, in the way Yitzchak spoke with Esav, and Esav's reaction to that is parallel to Rivka speaking with Yaakov and Yaakov's reactions. And then again in sections D, looking at those mirror narratives, we could understand the differences between Esav and Yaakov and the way that caused Rivka to favor Yaakov. We'll end with an insight taken from Rivka's assuaging of Yaakov's concerns. Note, this idea is far from pshat and is what we like to call a cute vort, something piquant. I think, I don't know, tell me how to pronounce that, with which to end the essay. Rivka states to her younger son, Alai kilalatcha b'ni, upon me be thy curse, meaning I'll take responsibility for it, right? This was when Yaakov was saying, A, what if Yitzchak finds out, and B, he'll view me as a deceiver, and I'll be cursed. And Rivka says, Alai kilalat chabani, the curse that would come to you will be upon me, my son. I'm going to take responsibility for this. I've got it. Just trust me. I'll handle things if issues arise. The word alai can be understood as an acrostic, ayin lamed yud, standing for Esav, Lavan, and Yosef. Those three were indeed the three sources of trouble for Yaakov throughout his life. To wit, Rivka is saying, Alai will be your curse, my son, right? Alai kilat chabani. And instead of saying it means, on me will be your curse, my son, Alai is Esav, Lavan, Yosef. Esav, Lavan, Yosef will be your curse, my son. Again, totally cute vort. After all three of these troubles befell Yaakov, he was discussing the second return of his sons to Egypt to purchase grain. His sons told him that they could not return without Binyamin. We're all the way now forward in Parshat Miketz. In protesting, he said, Yosef is not, Shimon is not, would you take Binyamin? Alai hayu kulana. Literally, upon me are all these things come. In our approach, we might suggest Alai, acrostically spelling out Esav, Lavan, and Yosef, were all of them, right? Alai were all of them. I've already had my three tragedies. Losing Binyamin just isn't in the cards. How can I send him down into the danger of Egypt? Losing him would extend beyond the curse that I was given before taking the blessing from Father, right? Which is also just a fascinating, putting aside the acrostic dimension, the sense of what was the baggage that Yaakov was carrying around with him over all those years. And Rav Klitzner's reading, he deals with more of that baggage already when he, wrestles with the Ish. And by the time the troubles with Yosef come, he's already a different person. But here we sort of see him still carrying the after effects of that initial deception. When analyzing a narrative, we need to maintain an internal cognitive flexibility about the order of events, especially when imagining ourselves in the narrative, significant questions arise. That was point one of the essay. By reevaluating the sequence of the text, we were able then, point two, to identify a clear chiasmus bridging two chapters. This revelation helped us resolve an unexplained favoritism in the text. Rebecca's love for Yaakov is mirrored by God's favoritism for Israel and the qualities that we all strive to cultivate, which is recognizing that which is in our control and doing the inner work on that, and trying to figure out that which is beyond our control and not be overly preoccupied by that. Yeah, appreciating Leela's comment, maintaining an internal flexibility in relation to the order of events. Yeah, it's the qualities of readership of the Tanakh is asks us to cultivate all different kinds of inner traits. Yep, indeed. In real life, time is not necessarily sequential. True. Questions, comments, or reactions before we wrap up? So this was a long one. Hopefully, it was clear as we worked our way through it.
Unmuted.
Yeah, we got you, Joan and Moshe. Please.
Yeah, the part, I came in a little late, so excuse me, but the part where just because they're without their children, that means that they didn't have children, that's an assumption on my part. And on the part of this writer who then makes that into a whole big deal. But certainly people travel without their children. They may have left them behind or have them with somebody else. So.
Yes, absolutely. We don't have to build an entire argument on that. And indeed, he cited at least one medieval commentary, the Ramban, who assumed that they were traveling with them, but they explained that they were, not their children. And his response to your question was that the more likely assumption in his mind is that they wouldn't have been left behind. But you're absolutely right, and this is the flexibility in interpretation. We're not given enough information, and therefore we don't have to be attached to any one interpretation or another. And different other factors may influence what we want to read and how. And there's often like a domino effect. Whichever we take as our fixed assumption or our anchor assumption then influences the way we read other things. And so I think you're absolutely right. We don't have to make that assumption. We could assume that they had been left behind, or were made other arrangements, and then that leaves this open for a straight chronological read. And that, by the way, doesn't preclude the rest of his interpretation. He sort of said we have to be able to put 25 and 27 next to each other in order to create this whole chiastic structure. That's true at a straight literary sense, but you could just say this is here for any of a variety of reasons, and I'm going to sort of excise it for the moment and look at these two stories, even though it intervenes and is there in forwards chronological order. So again, we always have a range of possibilities.
It's very
right. Nathan points out, but right, it would be hard to see Yitzhak leaving the boys behind if Canaan was suffering from famine, right? The motivation for their travel was the famine, so it would have been hard to leave them, back. Yep, Jonah Moshe, and then we'll come to Bracha.
To the contrary, I have to say that when you're going on such an important mission, you don't take your children with you. So you could argue it, and and by the way, it's very common in any kind of literature to have something very different. You have a pause and something different occurs, and then you go back to it. And the other thing I just want to say very quickly is I thought Rebecca favored one son because she saw that for the sake of Israel and the continuation of that's the common thing. She saw that it was the more appropriate one.
Yes. So absolutely, you're good to raise that. That's a very common interpretation and a very plausible one. I was just listening to a Rabbi Sachs, a lot of the Rabbi Sachs Parsha essays are available as podcasts in which he reads them. and I was listening to one about this, the story of taking the blessing, and he points out, as people have, that the moment in which Rivka seems to get that indication, that Yaakov is to be the next link in the chain and the, dominant brother, and therefore she wants to ensure the pathway for him to get the blessings, is this phrase, V'rav ya'avod tza'ir, the older will serve the younger. And Rabbi Sachs points out, as others have, that you could always read that differently. V'rav, and the older, Ya'avod Tza'ir, the younger will serve. And so it could be flipped on its head that actually Yaakov would serve Esav and Esav is the supreme one. There's enough ambiguity in the text to also allow that reading. And so he has a whole fascinating reading about this as an honest mistake, basically. That Rivka thinks that it's supposed to be this way, and she directs things in this direction. And it's not that um, it wasn't necessarily, it's just that it wasn't actually clear. And therefore, Yaakov really shouldn't have taken that blessing. And he regrets it, and they try to reconcile a whole different reading. So there's so much that can be introduced here. But you're absolutely right that I think the predominant pathway of interpretation is that Rivka was doing this because she had understood that prophetic message from God to be that Esav would be subservient to Yaakov, that Yaakov would be the next link in the chain, and therefore she had to intervene to ensure that Yaakov received the blessing. Of course, the whole other wrinkle in this story is that it seems like that blessing that Yitzchak had in mind for Esav was not actually the covenantal blessing. Based on what the actual contents, it's sort of a different thing. The covenantal blessing called Birkat Avraham actually is given to Yaakov after the whole story ends, before he leaves for Padan Aram towards the end of the Parsha in chapter 28. So it's an incredibly rich and complex narrative, but you're absolutely right about that, about the predominant reading. Bracha?
As children
Oh,
pose those problems.
yeah.
Any mother who knows you give this child this or that.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
a very common problem.
Okay, one
Yes.
quick question. Garia was in, what would be known as the Gaza?
Yeah. Yeah. It was the Gaza region, exactly, where the Philistines dwelt.
And they had food or they didn't have food,
They seem to have food there. Yeah.
well, it's close to Egypt, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, Bracha, on to you.
Okay, just to mention something something else that I had put in the chat. Famine often comes as a punishment and appears after Esav being denied food initially by Yaakov. So it's like a point counterpoint. And I say initially being denied food because how is it that your brother comes home from a day at work actively physically involved and is exhausted and has brought stuff home for his father to eat, and Yaakov's response is a business negotiation rather than, oh, I see you come in after having worked so hard and with food for our father. Here's a wonderful stew that I just made. Have some. There's not that sense of connection. It's just chilling.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's true. It's true. Yeah, because complicated relationships, no question. I see Nathan wrote in, ironically, I always thought the bigger question was why Yitzchak favored Esav, not why Rivka favored Yaakov. Absolutely. And it seemed to me at the outset of the essay that Rav Shalom asked that question, and I would have thought that he would have addressed it. He says, why did Yitzchak favor Esav? In other words, what is meant by Kitzai Befiv, and why did Rivka love Yaakov? And then says we need to look at what the text tells us about their interactions. But I don't think he ever quite circles. He definitely addresses Rivka and Yaakov, but it doesn't seem like he addresses Yitzchak and Esav. So that does remain an not fully addressed or unaddressed question in this essay and in general, what this Kitzai Befiv is all about. So it bears more thought. something to continue to muse on over the week. And again, thanks to everybody for working through this lengthy, slightly complex, really 2 essays in one. And I'll take a moment just to double check our calendar for next week before we sign off. Let's see. November 24th. Looks great. Look forward to seeing everybody then, if not before. Good night, love to mom and dad, and take care, everybody. Bye-bye.